This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted that Ambassador Erik Solheim has joined me today in conversation. How should one describe him? He's had such a legacied journey. Of course, much vaunted diplomat, part of the great Sri Lankan peace process, and now, of course, a great environmentalist promoting environmental causes around the world. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be with such a great person like yourself.
Ambassador, allow me to then begin with a question on BRICS, because that's the most immediate thing that has happened. A lot of the conversation around BRICS, not necessarily from the leaders themselves, but around BRICS, the mood seemed to have been that, well, there's the West, and then the West has its own way of looking at the world, but there is the rest, so to speak, and BRICS represents the rest, and they have their unique way of looking at the world. This sort of splintering, of course, is not good for the world. Reflect a little bit, Ambassador, if you will, on this divergence that's happening.
Look, the BRICS countries, of course, have basically nothing in common except that they want a world which is not dominated just by the West, and particularly the United States of America. They have very different political systems. They have very different level of development. They have in many issues different interests. So it's not a natural coalition which brings people together on a clear program. The program is, after 200 years of Western dominance, first 100 years of the colonial powers, France and the United Kingdom, which basically made havoc in Africa and India and so many other places, and then another 100 years of the United States. And all these nations want a much fairer world. They even want a much greener world, and they want a peaceful world, but they don't accept that there should be one standard, one set of rules for the West, and a completely different set of rules for the rest, meaning India, China, and all the others.
A little bit about this difference of opinion in looking at rules. We hear so much about a rules-based system, but in practice, Ambassador, not in theory, but in practice, there seems to be, even today, significant divergences in the way rules are applied. And that's what irks the rest, so to speak.
Absolutely. I think that's at the crux of this matter. Look, in Europe and America, there is a lot of talk about a rules-based order. But in reality, that means one set of rules for the West and another for the rest. Let me give you a few examples. The West, in my view, rightly has raised the issue of defense of the sovereignty of Ukraine against the Russian aggression. But if you believe in the sovereignty of Ukraine, you must also believe in the sovereignty of Palestine. And Palestine has been occupied by Israel for 57 years. The Israelis even occupy all of Palestine, while the Russians have only infringed on parts of Ukraine. So here is a complete difference in how these issues are treated. The United States has involved itself over the last decades in 80 regime change operations in other nations. Look, if India or China, any major power of the global south, started trying to change regimes in other nations by supporting military coups or assassinations of leaders or financial support for political parties of their liking, and the world there will be havoc in the world. But we cannot have a world where the United States can do that, but no one else can do it. And also, which is somewhat at the bottom of the dispute between India and Canada, well, look, the United States and Israel are killing off what they consider terrorists all over the world. But Canada won't even in reality work with India to stop people who are a threat to India, who want to carve out a separate state from Indian territory, but who are residing on Canadian territory. There have been no real willingness from Canada to find a way to work with India to kind of really work on this threat to India.
Let's also talk a little bit about imbalances in the multilateral system itself, Ambassador. Let's take the example of the United Nations. Many people in the West or in the global South believe today that the United Nations is really a broken system, Ambassador, and it does not in any shape or form accurately reflect the world order as it exists today. And yet, real change within the UN is not happening.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, when the United Nations was formed, the United Kingdom was still the biggest nation in the world. I mean, India, Myanmar, Africa was all parts of the United Kingdom at the time. It was a major power. And France controlled what's today Vietnam and Algeria, and also a huge number of colonies in Africa. At the time, the United Kingdom and France, they were very violent powers, but they were big powers. Now the United Kingdom and France are middle-sized European countries. Their economies are much smaller than the Indian economy. Population, of course, is 1/20th part, even less, of the Indian population. And still, these two nations are veto powers at the Security Council, while the biggest nation in the world, India, is soon to be third biggest economy in the world, India, and what will be with the United States and China, the main power of the 21st century, is not on the Security Council. This must change. Added, of course, Africa is not represented on the Security Council, and nor is Latin America. So a deep reform is needed. Europe's interest should be represented by the European Union, which is an all-European association, and France and the United Kingdom, sorry for them, will have to give up their seats. And the most obvious of all, India must get a seat on the council as the biggest nation in the world and one of the most powerful.
Another way that the world is sort of splintering, Ambassador, and allow me to put that to you before I go into India and Canada, an issue that you referred to. For a long time, especially when people like me were growing up in India in our school and college years, Ambassador, I want to put to you, we always looked at the West as a place of great progress, prosperity, many of these countries, great beauty, great architecture, great literature, and something to aspire to. Today, when I talk to younger people, my students, many others, they look at the West and they see riots on the streets, even in Europe. They see, racist divisions. They see, for instance, in America, opioid and other kind of fentanyl crises. They see a broken West, and therefore the aspirational value that people like me felt towards many parts of the West does not reflect anymore in people who are in their teenage years or in their 20s in places like India and other parts of the global South. That's another problem. Is that problem really recognized in the West, Ambassador?
First, just one word about the history. There was a paradox that the United Kingdom was the most democratic nation on earth in its domestic politics. It was the first place where a Labour Party came to power, and basically the democratic rights of the Brits in the United Kingdom was better than any other place in the world. At exactly the same time, like the Brits say, kill 1,500 Indians in Amritsar in 1919, and of course shorten the lives of millions of Indians. So you had this paradox. Yes, it was domestically very democratic, while it was the most violent power in the world outside the United Kingdom. And the United States has largely followed up that, while also other nations like Russia, of course, have waged many wars. But still, the United States is by far the most aggressive power in the world in the last 45 years, while being largely a model of democracy at home, at least for quite some time. Look, India has not been involved in any war with another nation except with Pakistan for the last 50 years. China has not been involved in any war for the last 45 years, and the other big nations of the global South, Indonesia, Brazil, has not been involved in any wars outside their territory at all in the time of their independence. So there's a huge discrepancy here between the domestically inspiring democracy, first in the United Kingdom and France, and then in the United States, and at the same time being the most aggressive powers on the global scene. Of course, now we have reached a point where, in particular in the United States, there is also a lot of question as to whether the American system is working for the American people. The American system never worked for the people of Guatemala or Iran or any other part of the world, but at least it worked for the Americans. But now you see 99% of all school shootings in the world is happening in one nation alone. The opioid crisis is in many nations, but not nowhere like in the United States. And the number of homeless people in the streets of Los Angeles or San Francisco is simply appalling. If you walk there, you are appalled. I mean, of course, on average, the Indians are much poorer, but you don't see anything like this in the big cities, I mean, of India, as you see in San Francisco and Los Angeles, who even claim to be the most liberal cities in the United States. So my suggestion is that the United States should take more time to reflect upon how it can improve its own system at home, make America work for all Americans, rather than being so much involved at every square meter of planet Earth outside the United States.
One aside question to this, Ambassador, before we move on, and which refers to your part of the world, so to speak, Scandinavia. Let's talk a little bit about, a place like, say, Sweden, right? I mean, I remember going to Malmo again and again as one of the nicest, friendliest parts of the world. We used to joke with our Swedish friends that, you have no crime in your country. And if a dog gets hurt with a cycle, that becomes your national headline because, you really don't have any other problems. And yet today, Malmo has some of the worst gang wars in the Western world. Now, again, people from places like India who watch this, they watch it with great trepidation that these almost perfect societies and almost perfect nations, at least that's what they seem like from the outside, are going through this turbulent period, and which is why the dissonance is growing.
You're absolutely right. I mean, Sweden now probably has the highest homicide rate in Europe. It's mainly within gangs. I mean, let's say the average law-abiding Swede is not that much directly affected by this, because it's different gangs killing each other, many of them very young, teenagers, even 15, 16 years old. How did this come about? I believe it happened because Sweden got its migration policies completely wrong. They didn't find a way to integrate the different migrant communities. They created a group, societies which were completely reflecting other parts of the world, and imported gangs from different parts of the world in the Balkans or in the Middle East into Sweden, and they didn't find a way to contain them. Denmark, Finland, and Norway, the three other Nordic countries, and Iceland, has not developed the same problem. So far, it's mainly a Swedish problem. But you are right. If anyone has asked 20 years ago, could this happen in Sweden? I would have said absolutely no. This cannot happen in Sweden, because Sweden is the social democratic paradise on earth, where everyone is respected, where there is very little crime, and a beautiful welfare system for which covering everyone. Maybe parts of the welfare system is also part of the problem, because if you are a gang member, of course you cannot get a high salary or a very decent pay from the welfare, but if you can get quite some money from welfare, and you can add up by selling drugs or being involved in petty crimes, it may combine give a decent income, which is, of course, not the way we want to organize societies.
Let's move on then, Ambassador, to the question that you raised a few minutes ago, which is India and Canada. You wrote a long post on X, Ambassador, talking about how the India-Canada, conflict has grown and why these dissonances exist and how they could be bridged. Now, of course, India-Canada are today in crisis. Diplomatic ties have broken down. There are constant, volleys sort of to and fro. We've never seen such a situation before. But deep-seated problems that go back 20 years that have led up to this moment. Talk to us a little bit about your reflections about how you see the India-Canada issue.
My reflection, unfortunately, is that this speaks very loudly about the arrogance of Canada and the arrogance of the West. Prime Minister Modi would never interfere in domestic politics in Canada, because he would think, I'm not competent to this, and it's not the way the international system should work, that I, as the Indian Prime Minister, should offer opinions on Canadian domestic politics. But look, Prime Minister Trudeau, he offered his opinions on the manifestations of the farmers in India when farmers protested against the BJP and Prime Minister Modi. Trudeau gave them full support. even if I believe that the policies of BJP is much closer to the policies of Canadian government, but he still found it fit to intervene in a domestic political issue in India. Let's assume that Prime Minister Modi were to intervene in, say, the so-called Yellow Vest demonstrations in Paris a few years ago. I mean, the reaction in Europe would be very, very strong. And we cannot have a world where Canada is free to intervene in domestic issues in India, but India cannot do it in Canada. Another very eclatant example of this was the European Parliament. Last year, it offered a resolution about the situation in the Indian state of Manipur. Well, there are 600 members of the European Parliament. I know a few of them. I bet that hardly anyone can put the finger on Manipur on the map. They have absolutely zero knowledge about the Métis and the Khakas, the main communities of Manipur. They know nothing of the place. But still they believe that Europe should put forward an opinion on how to handle the Manipur crisis. Again, put up the mirror image. Let's assume that Prime Minister Modi, or for that matter, Rahul Gandhi or any other Indian leader, offer an opinion on the crisis between Spain and Catalonia and the domestic issues in Spain. Again, the pushback from Europe would be enormous. And we cannot have a world where Canada is free to intervene in Indian politics and Indians are not free to intervene in European or Canadian politics. Added to all this, there is a community of very, very aggressive Sikhs in Canada, because most Sikhs are absolutely peaceful, but there are some advocating for a separate state of Khalistan, which would be a state where half the population would be Hindu, so it's not an obvious separate state. But when they do that and hint that violent means may be useful, they are putting up posters of Mr. Bindrawala, who also was a very violent Khalistan leader in the 1980s, as all Indians remember, but very few Canadians have ever heard the name of Bindrawala. You create this completely bizarre situation where Canada feels free to intervene in Indian domestic politics, and Canada is not really helpful in kind of finding a way to solve when there is violent agitation against India in Canada. And this reflects a world where the West still feel free that we are so knowledgeable, we should intervene everywhere. But of course, there will be no accept of the opposite. Look, when Putin, as I can see it, probably tried to intervene in the 2016 election in the United States to support Trump, there was a huge pushback in the United States. I mean, Americans didn't want that. But if they don't want Putin to intervene in the United States, maybe they should also stop intervening in domestic issues everywhere else.
Well said, Ambassador. This comes to the last part of our conversation, where I want to ask you to reflect on the broader point all of this adds up to. The world order is changing, Ambassador, and we cannot have a situation where like you said, Canada harbors, and this is a 20-year problem. Many people in the West, I don't think, even understand that this Khalistani terrorism cost India the life of a sitting prime minister. Most of the people don't even remember this. Now, I want to ask you about this question.
I recall this very well, because the first time I visited India was just after Indira Gandhi was assassinated. Unfortunately, there was also horrible killings of Sikhs in Delhi, probably orchestrated at the time of people within the Congress party. But you had a very violent situation in Punjab at the time. People were taken out of trains and just killed off. And the extremism of Bindrawala and his inner core cannot be accepted in any other society. So when you have this very, very violent history, it's of course not saying that most Sikhs or any Sikhs in Canada want to repeat this, but still you would expect Canada to work somewhat with India to rein in any chance of any repeat of this. This is one of the most violent parts of Indian modern history. I mean, look, India has been overall a miracle of peace, a nation with so many different religions, different class differences and poverty over the last 70 years. Still have been very little violence in India. Yes, in Kashmir, somewhat in the northeast, a few Maoists in a few states. But this experience of the Khalistan movement is one of the most violent histories of modern India. And of course, India desperately want to avoid anything like that, and Canada should help.
I want to ask you, Ambassador, you spent a lifetime as a diplomat. In Canada, Khalistanis were putting up billboards with the face of the sitting Indian High Commissioner, offering to pay money as a bounty for his head and for his address so that he can be assassinated. They were putting up videos of shooting bullets into his face, encouraging people to find him, find his address, and kill him. Would any other country tolerate this kind of thing day after day about their sitting ambassador in a different country?
If this happens, it's of course absolutely unacceptable, and you would expect the Canadian police and intelligence services to work closely with India to rein in any of this. That's, I mean, the most important way of stopping terrorism in the world is for the powers of the states to work closely together. During the Cold War, we had a horrible situation where basically the Americans supported all terrorists who were against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union supported all terrorists who were against the United States. That is creating havoc. Fortunately, we have nothing like this today, but we should work more closely between police and intelligence in different nations to help each other to rein in terrorism. And this is an eclatant example of one nation not really being helpful to another, even when the people-to-people relations between India and Canada are enormous. I mean, there are very few nations, at least with such a distance, where there are so much people-to-people relations and contact as between India and Canada. These are not neighbors in the geographical sense, but they have very close people-to-people contact, and that should the Canadian government should work on that basis, as I see it.
My last part of the conversation, Ambassador, at the heart of some of these conflicts is a different way of looking at sovereignty. Now, many countries in the West, because of their own experiences, don't look at sovereignty quite in the same way that post-colonial nations, especially like India, who have fought and have fought long and hard and sacrificed many lives to get independence and protect their sovereignty. Now, this collision between different ways of looking at sovereignty will constantly collide, and there will be talk about values and all kinds of things. But at the heart of it, it is a different way of looking at sovereignty between countries that haven't faced such challenges and post-colonial nations. How can the world reflect a little bit upon this challenge, Ambassador, and how can the world bridge this problem?
Look, the present situation in Europe with a huge number of basically national state is a process which happened through enormous warfare. Huge killings in the First and Second World War, but also before, and say what we Europeans call the 30 Years' War in the 1700s. All this gradually forced a situation where you got a nation state of Germany, another one of France, and of course after the Second World War, 10 million Germans have to move from what's today Eastern Europe into Germany. So the present setup of states in Europe is forced by war. You have a very similar development in China, except with absolute different outcome. The present Chinese state is also come from enormous wars. I mean, the wars in China are the most violent that Brandt has ever seen. But over time, it created one state over the biggest, it's the biggest territory dominated by one state anywhere in the world. Then comes Africa, out of colonialism. There are no clear borders, no natural borders. The borders are not following rivers or ethnicities. So basically, any state will have a huge number of ethnicities, and these ethnicities will also be in the neighboring states, or maybe many neighboring states. India is, of course, also not forced by war in this same sense, and India also has an enormous multi-ethnicity. There are more than 20 languages in India, bigger than my nation language Norway. But then after colonialism, Africa said, we don't want to change borders because that will create havoc. We start supporting ethnic minorities in the other nations against their leadership to benefit. I mean, it has happened for sure. But overall, they made borders kind of sacred. There was the kind of basic for the African Union, borders are sacred. And India is a huge union. It's bigger population-wise still than Africa, covering a huge territory with an enormous variety of ethnicities. I mean, a Tamil from Tamil Nadu cannot speak to a Hindu speaker in the north. I mean, Norwegian and Hindi is much more related than Tamil and Hindi in language terms. So the miracle that India has kept together for these 75 years with establishment of an Indian national identity. When a Tamil speaker from Tamil Nadu or a Gujarati speaker from Gujarat or a Bengali speaker from Bengal, they will always say, I'm Indian first. And secondly, I'm Tamil, I'm Bengali, whatever. We need to understand that these are very, very vulnerable constructions and they need to be defended and supported. And playing games with this is absolutely dangerous everywhere. But we don't understand that the process towards one China over a huge territory and 40, 50 states in Europe over the same territory, that with fairly defined borders, that's very different from what has happened in India, what's happened in Africa, and in many other parts of the world. When moving to India, to me, it's a miracle because it was not clear after the independence, when Nehru and Patel started the new India, Gandhi was murdered, the other division and all the horrible killings in the division with Pakistan. It was not clear at all that India, we had maybe 500 also Maharaja kingdoms, small kingdoms, was not clear that this entity will be able to define a clear national identity and a governing system based on federalism with a central government, but also the government of the state. It has worked, in my view, fantastically if you make any historical comparison. And India is now on the way to become a major global player, high economic growth. In the next decades, poverty will be wiped out in India, and it's also a global leader on the environment. So the world should celebrate this miracle of India and help India, of course, move ahead.
On that wonderfully positive note, Ambassador, we'll have to leave it there. Ambassador Erik Solheim, thanks very much for your time. I really want to thank you for your taking out time from your busy schedule in talking to me on Global Order. Of course, you can watch all of these interviews just by pressing the bell icon and subscribing to the Global Order channel on YouTube. And of course, all these interviews and other much more on geopolitics on our website. Thanks very much, Ambassador, for your time.
Thank you so much.